Chernobyl. What really happened? A forensic analysis of the chain of failure. The illusion of safety. When arrogance met physics. On April 26, 1986, at precisely 01:23:47, Reactor 4 of the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin Nuclear Power Station released approximately 400 times the radioactive contamination of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This single statistic, while staggering in its magnitude, fails to capture the profound systemic failures that preceded this moment, or the catastrophic chain reaction that nearly erased much of Europe from the map of habitable continents. The global response oscillated between terror and denial. While much of the Western world watched radiation clouds drift across Scandinavia with mounting alarm, certain officials in affected regions chose a different path, willful ignorance masked as bravado. In Turkey, where radioactive contamination was detected in tea crops, the Minister of Industry and Commerce infamously declared that radiation does not affect us, and that a little radioactive tea won't hurt, it might even taste better. This grotesque minimization of a global catastrophe was not unique to Turkey. It was symptomatic of the Soviet Union's pathological relationship with truth. The Soviet leadership, facing the death throes of an empire built on propaganda and paranoia, initially attempted to conceal the disaster from both the international community and its own citizens. For several critical days, as invisible death spread across Europe, Moscow remained silent. Radiation detectors in Sweden first raised the alarm, not Soviet transparency. This pattern of institutional mendacity would define the disaster's immediate aftermath. But it was also a symptom of the deeper disease, bureaucratic hubris, that had permitted the construction of fundamentally flawed reactor designs and the cultivation of a safety culture built on political expediency rather than engineering integrity. This is not merely a story about a meltdown. It is an examination of how an empire's arrogance, a reactor's inherent design flaws, and a cascade of human errors conspired to create one of history's most profound industrial disasters, and how three men, operating in conditions that defied human survival, prevented an even greater catastrophe that would have rendered half of Europe uninhabitable for centuries. 2. The anatomy of failure, understanding the RBMK 1000 reactor, the energy factory and its fatal flaw. To understand what went wrong, one must first understand what should have gone right. The RBMK 1000 reactor, a Soviet design acronym meaning high-power channel-type reactor, was in essence an industrial energy factory. At its core lay uranium-235, a radioactive isotope whose atomic nucleus, when struck by a neutron, splits in a process called fission. This splitting releases tremendous energy in two forms: heat and additional neutrons which strike other uranium atoms, perpetuating the reaction. In the reactor's normal operational state, this chain reaction is carefully managed. The heat generated, reaching temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, is transferred to water circulating through pressure tubes. This water, maintained under extreme pressure to prevent it from boiling despite the heat, carries thermal energy to steam generators. The resulting high-pressure steam drives turbines connected to electrical generators, producing the electricity that powered much of Ukraine and Belarus. The reactor's power output is controlled by inserting or withdrawing control rods, essentially neutron absorbers made of boron carbide. Inserting the rods captures neutrons, slowing the chain reaction and reducing power. Withdrawing them allows more neutrons to interact with uranium, increasing power. This seemingly simple mechanism is the operator's primary tool for managing the immense forces contained within the reactor core. However, the RBMK 1000 possessed a fatal characteristic that Western reactor designs had deliberately avoided: a positive void coefficient. This technical term describes a terrifying feedback loop. When water in the reactor begins to boil, it forms steam voids, bubbles. In most reactor designs, these voids reduce reactivity because water serves as both coolant and neutron moderator. Remove the water and the reaction slows. But in the RBMK 1000, graphite, not water, served as the primary moderator. When steam voids formed, they actually increased reactivity by removing neutron-absorbing water while leaving the graphite moderator intact. The implications were catastrophic. The hotter the reactor got, the more it wanted to get even hotter. This was not merely a design compromise. It was a fundamental instability written into the physics of the system. Western engineers had recognized this danger decades earlier and rejected positive void coefficient designs. Soviet engineers, working under pressure to rapidly scale nuclear power production and constrained by material limitations, accepted the risk and implemented operational procedures intended to manage it. These procedures, as events would prove, were insufficient protection against the perfect storm of circumstances that would converge on the night of April 25, 1986. The deferred test, a dangerous experiment. The test scheduled for that night had been repeatedly delayed, a postponement that would prove lethal. The objective was deceptively simple: determine whether, in the event of a complete loss of external electrical power, the reactor's turbines could continue spinning long enough, their rotational inertia gradually declining, to power the emergency cooling pumps for the 30 to 40 seconds required for backup diesel generators to start. This was a legitimate safety concern. Nuclear reactors face a paradoxical vulnerability. They require electrical power to prevent meltdown, even after shutdown. The decay heat from recently split atoms continues for hours after the chain reaction stops, requiring constant cooling. Loss of coolant flow, even briefly, can cause the fuel to overheat, its metal cladding to fail, and the release of radioactive materials. The test procedure called for reducing reactor power to approximately 25% of normal output, then disconnecting the turbine from the electrical grid while observing whether its coast-down provided sufficient power. However, a series of compounding errors transformed this routine safety verification into a recipe for disaster. First, the test had been delayed by hours due to unexpected electrical grid demands, meaning the crew conducting the test was not the experienced day shift, but the less experienced night shift. Second, when operators attempted to reduce power, they overshot catastrophically. The reactor's output plummeted to just 30 megawatts thermal, far below the intended 700 to 1,000 megawatts, and dangerously close to the point where xenon-135 poisoning would make the reactor extremely difficult to control. Xenon-135 is a fission product that acts as an extremely powerful neutron absorber. At low power levels, xenon builds up because it is produced faster than it decays. This creates a situation where operators must withdraw more and more control rods to maintain even minimal power, effectively removing the reactor's safety margin. The test protocol required a minimum number of control rods to remain inserted at all times. In their attempt to increase power back to test conditions, operators violated this critical safety requirement, leaving the reactor in an extremely unstable configuration. They had, in engineering terms, removed all the control authority from the system. The reactor was balanced on a knife's edge, and they were about to push it over. 3. The night of the catastrophe. When physics took revenge at 01-2304, 43 seconds before the explosion that would change history, operators initiated the test by closing the turbine steam valves. This action, intended to simulate the loss of electrical power they were testing for, had an immediate and unanticipated effect. With less steam being extracted, pressure in the reactor increased slightly, causing more water to flash to steam, which in turn increased reactivity due to the positive void coefficient. The reactor's power began to climb. Operators, recognizing the danger, triggered the emergency shutdown system known as AZ-5, which would insert all control rods simultaneously. This should have been the action that saved them. Instead, it was the catalyst for catastrophe. The RBMK control rods possessed another fatal design flaw, one that Soviet engineers were aware of but had rationalized as acceptable. The rods were tipped with graphite, a neutron moderator, rather than being entirely composed of neutron-absorbing material. When fully withdrawn, these graphite tips sat above the reactor core. When the AZ-5 button was pressed, and the rods began their descent, the graphite tips entered the core first, momentarily displacing water, and actually increasing reactivity in the lower portion of the reactor before the boron carbide absorbers could take effect. This phenomenon, known as the positive scram effect, created a localized power surge at precisely the moment when operators believed they were shutting the reactor down. In the reactor's already critical state, this surge was immediately catastrophic. Power spiked to an estimated 33,000 megawatts thermal, 10 times the reactor's maximum rated output, in less than 3 seconds. The superheated fuel elements fractured explosively. Water in the pressure channels flashed instantly to steam at pressures exceeding 1,000 atmospheres. The resulting steam explosion, essentially the world's largest pressure cooker catastrophically failing, generated sufficient force to lift the 2,000-ton concrete and steel upper biological shield, called the Elena, several meters into the air. Witnesses described seeing this immense structure jump, tilt, and fall back onto the reactor cavity, leaving the core exposed to the atmosphere. 2 workers in the reactor hall, Valery Kodomchuk and Vladimir Shoshanok, died instantly, their bodies never recovered, entombed forever in the ruins of Reactor 4. They were the first victims, but far from the last. Seconds later, a second explosion occurred, likely a hydrogen detonation as superheated graphite and zirconium reacted with steam, liberating hydrogen that then ignited when mixed with air. This blast completed the reactor's destruction, scattering fragments of intensely radioactive fuel across the reactor building's roof and surrounding area, igniting multiple fires fueled by graphite and bitumen insulation. Local firefighters, responding to what they believed was an ordinary industrial fire, arrived within minutes. They had no radiation detectors, no protective equipment beyond their standard firefighting gear, and no understanding of the invisible death permeating the air they breathed. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik and his crew ascended to the reactor building's roof, where they confronted flames emerging from the destroyed reactor, while standing directly above an exposed nuclear core emitting radiation levels exceeding 20,000 roentgens per hour, a dose sufficient to kill within hours. Witnesses reported an acrid metallic taste in their mouths, the distinct sensation of ionizing radiation destroying cells in their oral tissue. Their skin began to darken and tighten, a phenomenon they would not understand until much later, the immediate onset of acute radiation syndrome. Pravik and many of his crew would be dead within 2 weeks, their bodies ravaged by radiation doses that destroyed their bone marrow, gastrointestinal lining, and immune systems. Through their sacrifice, fighting fires while unknowingly absorbing lethal radiation doses, they succeeded in preventing the fire from spreading to Reactor 3, which shared a common roof structure with Reactor 4. Had they failed, a second reactor would have been destroyed, doubling the immediate release of radioactive materials. By dawn, the immediate fires were largely contained, but the crisis was only beginning. Deep beneath the shattered reactor, a far greater catastrophe was slowly taking shape, one that would require an act of almost suicidal courage to prevent. In the days following the explosion, while Soviet authorities focused on managing the immediate radiation release by dropping thousands of tons of boron, sand, lead, and clay from helicopters onto the exposed reactor core, engineers studying the situation beneath the reactor made a horrifying discovery. The reactor's core had not simply exploded, it was melting. At temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees Celsius, the mixture of uranium oxide fuel, graphite moderator, and structural materials had liquefied into a radioactive lava called corium. This incandescent mass, containing dozens of tons of intensely radioactive material, was burning through the concrete floors beneath the reactor, advancing at a rate of approximately 30 centimeters per day. Directly in its path lay 2 massive water reservoirs, cooling pools, and firefighting water that had accumulated in the basement levels beneath the reactor. When engineers calculated what would happen if the 1200-degree corium contacted this water, they confronted a scenario almost too terrible to comprehend. The interaction would produce a thermohydraulic explosion, a phenomenon occurring when extremely hot material suddenly contacts water, causing instantaneous vaporization. The water would convert to steam in microseconds, expanding in volume by a factor of 1,100, and generating pressures capable of obliterating everything above it. Models suggested such an explosion would have a force between 3 and 5 megatons, equivalent to 3 to 5 million tons of TNT. To place this in context, the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki had a yield of 21 kilotons, 21,000 tons of TNT. The predicted Chernobyl steam explosion would be 140 to 230 times more powerful. Such a blast would not merely destroy Reactor 4, it would obliterate Reactors 1, 2, and 3 as well, releasing their entire radioactive inventories. The resulting contamination would render Ukraine uninhabitable, contaminate the water supplies of 30 million people across multiple nations, and deposit lethal levels of radiation across vast swaths of Europe for decades or centuries. The question facing plant management was brutally simple. How do we drain these pools before the corium reaches them? The answer was equally brutal. Someone must enter the radioactive water, locate the drainage valves in complete darkness, and open them manually. The volunteers, Anonkelko, Bespalov, and Baranov, plant managers assembled the available engineers and technicians, explained the situation without euphemism, and asked for volunteers. The mission would require entering basement corridors flooded with radioactive water, to depths exceeding 1 meter, navigating in near-total darkness through a maze of pipes and valves, and manually operating drainage valves that were never designed for manual operation, all while exposed to radiation levels that could not be accurately measured because they exceeded the maximum range of available dosimeters. The officials did not sugarcoat the risks. They explained that volunteers would almost certainly develop acute radiation syndrome. They promised that families of anyone who died would be cared for by the state. What they could not promise was survival. 3 men stepped forward. Alexei Onanenko, a senior engineer who had worked on the plant's valve systems during construction and knew their locations better than anyone. Valery Bespalov, another engineer who had collaborated with Onanenko on the safety systems. And Boris Baranov, a shift supervisor who volunteered to accompany them as a third pair of hands and to operate the portable lighting equipment they would need in the flooded darkness. Onanenko would later explain his decision in characteristically understated terms. I thought about refusing at first, but I was the one who knew where the valves were. How could I not go? This was not heroic posturing, but professional duty understood at its most fundamental level. He possessed knowledge that was essential to preventing catastrophe, and therefore he had an obligation to act. On the night of May 4, 1986, these 3 men prepared to descend into what every engineer present believed would be their tomb, descent into the radioactive abyss. They donned rudimentary protective equipment, diving suits that would provide minimal protection against beta radiation, but were essentially transparent to the gamma rays permeating the basement.
They carried 2 dosimeters, radiation measurement devices, one held at chest level, another strapped to a leg to measure the radiation levels in the water itself. These devices had a maximum reading of 1,000 Roentgens per hour, both immediately pegged at their maximum range, their needles unable to indicate just how far beyond safe limits the radiation had climbed. The descent route took them through increasingly damaged corridors, past ruptured pipes, spewing scalding steam mixed with radioactive particulates, into basement levels that should never have been accessible but had been torn open by the explosion's force. The air itself seemed hostile, thick with the metallic tang of ionizing radiation and the oppressive heat radiating from the molten core somewhere above them. They entered the flooded corridor knee-deep in water that had been directly contaminated by contact with radioactive materials, water that was itself intensely radioactive. Baranov, monitoring the dosimeters, watched the readings with growing unease. The water's radioactivity exceeded their measurement capability by an unknown factor. Every second of contact with this water was shortening their lives by some unknowable amount. They described the sensation of this exposure as feeling like thousands of needles piercing their skin simultaneously. The actual destruction of living cells by ionizing radiation, a process their bodies were experiencing in real time. Their skin began to darken and tighten, a phenomenon called radioactive bronzing, where radiation damage causes immediate changes to skin pigmentation and texture. In the flickering beam of Baranov's flashlight, navigating through a forest of pipes and valves in nearly complete darkness, they searched for the specific valves that controlled drainage from the cooling pools. The normal method, electronic actuation from the control room, had been destroyed by the explosion and subsequent flooding. Every valve would have to be manually opened, requiring physical force against mechanisms that had likely been corroded by the radioactive water. Time became their enemy. Every minute spent searching meant another minute of radiation exposure, yet rushing risked missing the correct valves or inadvertently opening the wrong ones, which could trigger other failures. Anenko, drawing on his knowledge of the plant's construction, guided them through the maze with systematic precision, occasionally climbing onto pipes to reduce contact with the water, always moving forward toward the valve locations he had committed to memory. When they finally located the valves, massive gate valves requiring dozens of rotations to fully open, they found them seized by corrosion and debris. Using tools they had carried into the basement, they worked to free the mechanisms, their hands immersed in radioactive water, their bodies absorbing radiation at rates that should have been lethal. The first valve resisted, then suddenly gave way. The second valve opened more easily. They could hear the rush of water as thousands of liters began draining from the pools above them, flowing down through pipes and out through drainage systems that had never been intended to handle such volumes under such conditions. The pools were emptying. The mission that experienced engineers had predicted would take hours, if it could be completed at all, had taken less than 1 hour. Anenko, Bespalov, and Baranov emerged from the basement to the applause of their colleagues, who understood they had just witnessed an act of almost incomprehensible courage. The corium, still advancing downward through the reactor structure, would eventually solidify before reaching the now drained basements. The mega-steam explosion that would have devastated Europe never occurred. 3 engineers, operating in conditions that defied human survival, had prevented the catastrophe that would have dwarfed even the explosion that had already occurred. The aftermath, myths, reality, and historical irony. Separating legend from truth, the story of Anenko, Bespalov, and Baranov quickly took on mythological proportions. Early accounts claimed they had died immediately upon completing their mission, succumbing within hours or days to the massive radiation doses they had absorbed. These reports, while emotionally compelling, were factually incorrect, a testament to how catastrophic events spawn legends that obscure reality. The truth was simultaneously more complex and more hopeful. The 3 men did indeed suffer radiation exposure during their mission. They exhibited symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, nausea, fatigue, and the characteristic skin darkening that marked everyone who had been exposed to intense radiation fields. However, several factors saved them from the lethal doses that killed the firefighters and other first responders. First, they completed their task with exceptional speed, minimizing their exposure time. Second, water, despite being contaminated, is an effective radiation shield, particularly against beta particles. The very water they had waded through provided some protection against the worst of the radiation. Third, they received immediate medical treatment, including chelation therapy to help their bodies eliminate radioactive isotopes. Boris Baranov, who had carried the lighting equipment and monitored the dosimeters, lived until 2005, when he died of a heart attack at age 65. His death, occurring 2 decades after the mission, cannot be definitively attributed to his Chernobyl exposure, though radiation certainly impacted his long-term health. Valery Bespalov and Alexei Anenko survived their mission and, as of 2025, are still alive. Both men have spoken occasionally about their experience, consistently downplaying their heroism and emphasizing that they simply did what needed to be done. Anenko has described the physical aftermath, the persistent dark patches on his legs, where the radioactive water had the most contact, the ongoing health monitoring, the understanding that his exposure would have lifetime consequences. Bespalov recalled the shower they took immediately after emerging from the basement, scrubbing themselves repeatedly, while a dosimeter held near their bodies continued to register dangerous radiation levels. No amount of washing could immediately remove the radioactive contamination that had bonded to their skin and been incorporated into their bodies. Their survival does not diminish their sacrifice. They volunteered for a mission they believed would kill them, accepting that death in service of preventing a greater catastrophe. That they survived is fortune, not certainty, and does not reduce the magnitude of what they chose to do. The Soviet officials who had initially attempted to conceal the disaster found their efforts futile. Within days, elevated radiation readings across Europe forced Moscow to acknowledge what had occurred. The attempted cover-up, rather than protecting the Soviet Union's reputation, became evidence of its fundamental dishonesty and disregard for human welfare, contributing to the cascade of events that would, within 5 years, lead to the Soviet Union's dissolution. The plant managers and engineers who had permitted the safety test to proceed under dangerous conditions faced prosecution, though many argued they were scapegoats for systemic failures that extended far beyond their individual decisions. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer who had overseen the test, served 3 years in prison before being released due to deteriorating health from radiation exposure. He maintained until his death in 1995 that the reactor's design flaws, not operator error, were the primary cause of the disaster. History has largely vindicated Dyatlov's position. Subsequent investigations revealed that Soviet nuclear authorities had known about the RBMK reactor's positive void coefficient and positive scram effect for years before Chernobyl, but had classified these findings as state secrets rather than implementing design corrections or enhanced safety procedures. The disaster was not simply the result of operator error. It was the inevitable consequence of deploying inherently unstable reactor designs, combined with a safety culture compromised by political considerations. The cost was measured in lives destroyed, land rendered uninhabitable for centuries, and a technology nuclear power permanently tainted in public consciousness by an accident that should never have been possible with properly designed systems and competent oversight. Final verdict, written in blood. There is an old saying in engineering, regulations are written in blood. Every safety rule, every design requirement, every operational procedure exists because somewhere someone died when that rule did not exist. The Chernobyl disaster added entire chapters to nuclear safety regulations, written in the blood of the 31 people who died in the immediate aftermath, the thousands who died prematurely from radiation-induced cancers in subsequent decades, and the hundreds of thousands whose lives were irrevocably altered by displacement, contamination, and fear. The exclusion zone surrounding Chernobyl, encompassing approximately 2,600 square kilometers, remains largely uninhabited decades later. The city of Pripyat, built to house the plant workers and their families, stands as a monument to abandonment. Apartments with breakfast dishes still on tables, schools with lesson plans still on chalkboards, an amusement park that never opened, its Ferris wheel rusting in silence. Yet within this zone of exclusion, nature has returned with surprising vigor. In the absence of human activity, wildlife populations have rebounded. Wolves, bears, and endangered species now thrive in areas too radioactive for permanent human habitation. The trees and grasses absorb radioactive isotopes, concentrating them in their tissues, but continue to grow. Life persists, even here, though in forms adapted to carrying burdens of radioactive contamination that would be unthinkable elsewhere. The reactor itself, too dangerous to dismantle, has been entombed. The initial sarcophagus, hastily constructed in the months following the disaster, was replaced in 2016 by the new safe confinement, an immense steel arch that will contain the radioactive materials for an estimated 100 years, by which time their radioactivity will have decayed somewhat, and decommissioning technologies may have advanced sufficiently to permit final disposal. Inside that confinement, shielded by thousands of tons of concrete and steel, lies the corium that nearly reached the water pools, stopped not by engineered safety systems but by 3 men who chose to descend into radioactive darkness because it was necessary. This ultimately is the lesson of Chernobyl, that the catastrophes we prevent are as important as those we respond to, that engineering systems must be designed to accommodate human fallibility rather than assuming perfect operation, and that when all else fails, there are always individuals willing to risk everything to prevent disaster from becoming apocalypse. And Anyuko, Bespalov, and Baranov are not household names. They received no international acclaim, no monuments, no films celebrating their actions. Yet their mission prevented a disaster that would have dwarfed what actually occurred, a disaster that would have rendered the comparison to Hiroshima not a matter of 400-fold greater radiation release, but a fundamentally different category of catastrophe. They understood that sometimes duty requires accepting probable death. They chose to act anyway, and in doing so they saved millions of lives that will never know they were saved. That is the real story of Chernobyl, not just what happened but what nearly happened and the men who stepped into the abyss to prevent it. End.